About October 23rd, the old Roman-era kingdom is veiled in mystery. However, we do know that it was not at all the years of cultural and respectful dignity, later republic. Instead, the Roman kingdom was a place distinguished by poverty, dirt, and violence. In the early years, it is probably hence the Roman approach of waging war was not appreciably different from that of other Italic peoples. Local wars and raids often had numerous clans cooperating cooperatively. Within these warbands were the clan warriors. The concept of a uniform was non-existent. The quality and amount of weaponry and equipment would vary widely. Clan soldiers were without armor, and their usual war gear comprised of a shield and 2 spears, one to be thrown as a missile weapon, while the other was retained for stabbing. During this period, a clan warrior who achieved enough power and prestige would inevitably find himself in the position of chieftain. The chieftain acted as the leader and kept the restless clans alongside. His other equally significant function was to properly split the loot. A chieftain's prestige was judged by the spoils he could afford to his clan. This also extended to his own equipment. Chieftains were often resplendent in dazzling bronze helmets, pectorals, and greaves. Their swords, also bronze, were meant mainly for cutting, but also might be used to push or jab. It was above all the sword which was the chieftain's insignia, which proclaimed his status in society and prowess in conflict. Under the leadership of Rome's 6th king, Servius Tullius, a significant overhaul of the military was undertaken, which reformed the state exclusively for war. Here began the formation of a citizen army, which induced Rome's residents to arm themselves. A census of all adult male citizens recorded the value of their property and grouped them accordingly into 5 economic classes. A citizen's economic class defined the quality of their military contribution. The Romans also acquired more Greek equipment to augment their gear, complementing the new professional standards of the new citizen army. First-class citizen soldiers, the wealthiest, fought with the whole armored set characteristic of a hoplite, a helmet, 2-piece corselet, and greaves, all of bronze. They also carried the clypeus, a bull-shaped shield. In this new form of spear and shield warfare, the weapon of affluent citizens was the long thrusting spear. First-class citizen troops also held a sword, but in contrast to prior clan leaders, the sword was now very much a secondary weapon. Men of the second class were armed identically to those of the first, but were not expected to provide a complete breastplate. They also did not use the round clypeus shield and were instead endowed with the oblong scutum shield, which was cheaper and offered improved protection to the torso and legs. Furthermore, with the scutum, a soldier could be both defensive and offensive, parrying but also punching with its metallic boss plate. The least well-off citizens would have had nothing so elaborate as the copper or linen breastplates that richer citizens wore. But those who could provide themselves with a modest bronze breastplate? To compensate for their lack of armor, these soldiers utilized the oval scutum instead of the circular clypeus. The 4th and 5th grades marked the lowest rung of the Servian system. Troops fighting in these classes were outfitted as skirmishers and little else. 4th-class soldiers were supposed to be equipped with an oblong shield, spear, javelin, and sword, while 5th-class soldiers were most often left with nothing but slings and stones, with some soldiers scraping up enough finances to outfit themselves with a javelin. The end of the monarchy ushered in the Roman Republic. Under this republic, the old Servian system would grow further into a civilization whose citizens were bound to defend their property by giving to the military. In terms of equipment, the Roman soldier in this period was still heavily influenced by Greek norms, with bronze helmets, breastplates, and greaves. Their arms were most usually spears, swords, and daggers. The 4th century gave the Romans a lesson in shame. Their defeat to the Gauls at Alia in 390 BC led to the city's sacking and possibly destruction, if not for the mythical Marcus Furius Camillus. Later defeats to the Samnites prompted Rome to reassess their approach. Following the disaster of the Caudine Forks in 321 BC, the Roman army instituted the Camillan reforms, dropping their rigid phalanx in support of a manipular system, breaking the legion into multiple blocks spread out for mobility. The new legionary, like his hoplite counterpart, excelled at close-quarters combat, but the legion had greater freedom of movement and flexibility. In the new legion, the first line contained maniples of hastati. These were troops of few means who were unarmored except for a bronze helmet and a pectoral plate. They carried a scutum and 2 tossing pila, one hefty and one lightweight, plus a short thrusting sword. The second line was made up of maniples of principes. They were males in the peak of their lives. They were fairly rich and were able to afford adequate equipment. They were armed with 2 hefty pilla and a sword, which was used after the spear had been thrown. They generally carried a scutum, either in the oval or rectangular shape, and wore conical hats, often with feathers attached on top to boost stature. Principes wore thick armor, most frequently chainmail, which offered good protection without hampering movement. The third line was made up of the oldest and most mature males, comprised of maniples of triarii. Many triarii were combat-hardened veterans. They frequently donned a distinguishing Etrusco-Corinthian helmet, usually decorated with upright feathers and a horsehair crest. They outfitted themselves with a long iron mail shirt, with an italic strap-on bronze greave on their left leg, though several triarii would outfit themselves with a pair. They also carried a scutum and a long thrusting spear or hosta, with a huge socketed iron spearhead and a golden butt spike. Essential to their kit were the gladius, a short thrusting sword, and a knife, the pugio. Despite the early accomplishments of the manipular system, the Middle Republic saw Rome's legions brutalized in the Punic Wars. Tactical weakness and eventual manpower shortages underlined the need for a new pool of recruits to draw from. Short of the desperation in conscripting slaves, the next best thing was the lowest class of Rome's citizenry, the proletarii. These younger and poorer residents made up the bulk of skirmisher infantry, the velites. These skirmishing infantry had been around since Rome's early days but became a staple of Roman soldiers by the early Middle and late Republican times. Marked by their headgear, wolfskin cover, which was utilized to be distinguishable from a distance, velites were armed with the gladius and a bundle of javelins. In 107 BC, a general and statesman by the name of Gaius Marius implemented a new system of reforms aimed at rebuilding the Roman army, which had strained to keep up with the growing needs of an expanding empire. The Marian reforms established a professional standing army, replacing the property-based system with regular pay and eligibility for full citizenship and land ownership upon completion of service. The army's structure moved from maniples to cohorts, enhancing flexibility and cohesiveness. More crucial, it standardized equipment and clothing, leading to the idea of the soldier we know today as the typical Roman legionary. The legionary was outfitted with numerous carryovers from the pre-Marian troops, such as the pilum, scutum, pugio, and gladius. In addition to this, they wore armor components like the Montefortino hat and chainmail armor. These were not the only parts available to a legionary, yet would have been the most common. An essential addition to the legionaries' equipment was the caligae, or hobnailed boots. These were heavy, sole open-toed military sandals made for durability, protecting the feet while also allowing flexibility and ease of movement. Following the civil wars of the late Republic, Gaius Octavius emerged as Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Augustus chopped down the swollen and opportunistic legions of the Civil War era, reforming the army into a permanent army of 28 legions and instigating the finest period of Roman growth. He was the first commander to lay explicit terms of service, rates of compensation, and pensions. The legions were no longer a citizen militia. No one but Augustus had the right to raise additional legions, which now owed their fealty to him alone. In this period of military reform, equipment was once again further centralized. A major development in the early Principate period was the obvious difference in military identity through military belts, the balteus and caligae, which recognized a man as a soldier. Numerous cohorts were still armed with the chainmail typical to the troops of the late Republic. Nevertheless, the Montefortino style and Culus style helmets were beginning to be phased away as legionaries were fitted with more elaborate Gallic and Italic style designs. These helmets featured ear guards and hinged cheek guards, covering the greatest possible region of the face without confining the soldier's breathing, sight, and screaming range. The first century saw the legionary outfitted in what is now their most well-known look. This included the introduction of segmented plate armor, constructed of circular strips of metal attached to interior leather straps, known today as lorica segmentata. This armor was virtually impervious to ancient weaponry. In addition, the legionary scutum had evolved from the oblong ovals of the Republican era into a smaller, more lightweight rectangular shield. In its place, legionaries wore a heavier helmet of single-bowl build. These offered outstanding protection for the head and neck, but the cheek pieces obstructed peripheral vision and did not feature ear openings. The soldier's mail now had sleeves reaching down to the elbows. Notably, the legionaries would wear full trousers, socks, and shoes, known as caligae. Legionaries used a weighted pilum, a pugio, and a scutum, while the gladius was replaced by a spatha, which was still used for thrusting but might also be used for slashing. Later, legionaries carried a gently dished oval shield that began replacing the scutum during the 3rd century. They were of plank construction, with reinforcement bars and sewn-on rawhide edging. Soldiers carried a pilum and their enormous swords. Despite their length, they were still a cut-and-thrust weapon. Notwithstanding the modification of the sword, these legionaries still carried a pugio. Their short mail shirt was worn over a padding. Armed gear, the iron helmet, a far simpler piece, was comprised of many miniature parts welded together. Such helmets became the standard, as they were cheaper and easier to create. Since the 2nd century AD, a significant class of people had established themselves within Roman society, the Barbarians. These were persons who existed outside the Roman viewpoint of civility and culture. They were indigenous people hailing from the regions of Europe and outside of the empire. Since the early Principate, numerous barbarians had served the empire as auxiliaries, but following the crises of the 3rd century, they began to dwell in the empire more permanently, reshaping their role in the Roman military. To alleviate recruitment issues, many barbarians began to be conscripted directly into the army and served under Roman officers. Barbarian troops constituted the nucleus of the Roman armies in the chaotic 3rd century. They donned bronze-scale armor. They were armed with a lancia, a reasonably light spear that could be hurled just before interaction or stored for hand-to-hand battle. Their shield was a big, dished oval, built of wood boards coated and bound with leather. It also had a hollow iron boss, which covered the center hand grip. Under Emperor Diocletian, the crisis of the 3rd century ultimately concluded to stabilize the empire. Diocletian instituted a wide array of improvements. Among these was the restoration of systematic annual conscription of Roman citizens, not seen since the Roman Republic, and a reform of the military that split the army into 2 divisions, frontier guards, or limitanei, and mobile forces, or comitatenses. Warriors would be outfitted especially for the duties expected of its division, though the technique of universal uniformity would be supplanted by the issue of a clothing allotment, meant soldiers had to organize their own dress accordingly. Responsible for manning the defense outposts and garrisons of the empire's borderlands, the limitanei varied from young conscripts to old veterans. They were lightly equipped compared to their mobile counterparts, wearing a Berkasovo-type helmet with little else in the form of armor. They carried an oval shield, a spear, a tiny hunting knife, and a pilum. Comitatenses were generally better armed and drilled than the limitanei, functioning as rapid response to any external dangers to the empire. They wore a ridge helmet with cheek guards, but without nose or neck guards. The helmet also wore a bright plume, composed of stiffened horsehair. They wore mail with elbow-length sleeves and a hem going down to protect the thighs. Underneath, they wore a long-sleeved shirt and leather shoes. They carried a sword and their primary weapon, the lancia, a spear which was light enough to be thrown shortly before contact. Palatini were the elites of the late Roman army, as they acted similarly to the comitatenses. These elite forces outranked both them and the limitani. The Palatini's competence made them avidly desired by Roman military commanders. They donned a plumed version of the ridge helmet. These plumes were frequently hardened horsehair, and they matched shield colors to help unit identification. Like the comitatenses, they carried both a spear and hand sword. While Rome would fall in the 5th century, the development of Roman units would continue for almost 1,000 years under the Byzantines. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fascinating stories from the past.